Fantastic. There we go. So, hello. Let's see, will people start jumping in? Hello and welcome. We're back to you with the Marketing Cloud practical use cases, starting for beginners essentially. And today, topic of our session is going to be journeys. We will be starting in a few minutes, and as you join in, one of the asks for you today is a quick survey that we've got, just to get a bit of a feedback from you to understand how easy or hard it is for you to follow the course. Was it practically useful, not useful, what might be missing, and what other things that you might want to see added to that. I think some of the questions came up last time around that, and I thought we might just put together a very quick and brief session. So if you go in the browser or on the phone into that URL, https://minty.com, and then use this 8-digit number that will allow you to provide or get into the survey. There are 3 phases to go through. One of them, it will ask you which country you're joining from. Second one will actually ask these sort of few questions around the course, the structure, the content, how it works for you or not. And then the third one is where you can provide additional feedback to say, what are the things that you might find useful for the course. So once again, just minty.com. Join. We're using these 8 digits, and we'll keep it a few minutes for allowing you to contribute and fill it out. It should allow you to progress through the feedback without any challenges. So excellent, and I'll keep that open. All right. Let me just share a screen here. Wow, we've got people from Canada as well joining up today. I'm just curious, time-wise, it must be fairly late for US and Canada. All right, Romania. That's great. Welcome. Philippines. Fantastic. Yeah, it's midnight in Canada. I can see that. Very dedicated. That's great. Well, I'm glad that we've got the recordings for you, and really appreciate you joining up. Of course, means a lot to us. All right, go to the next one. Have a quick look. Okay, it's reasonably easy to follow. Hands-on, easy to follow, and good recommendation score. That's great. Glad that it works for you guys. More examples in real time. I always look for additional feedback because it's sort of something that helps to improve and add value to the session. So yeah, feel free to drop in anything you feel like. I'll switch into the course, and I always say feedback is always valuable. For me, I looked at that as an opportunity to improve. At the same time, assumptions that we make internally, specifically when we're at Salesforce or when we're doing community sessions, it's quite challenging to find the right fit for everyone on the course. Part of my learning experience over the course of last year was to kind of get an understanding and sort of get the concept of every single learner is different. There is no such thing as average learner. And I quite enjoyed learning a few tips and tricks on structuring the learning content altogether. I'll leave the surveys open, so feel free to add on to that at any point in time. We're gonna kick off and start, because I think we've got a few more folks joined already. So without any further ado, let's get into the actual session. So the point for us today is journeys, and we're gonna talk about how to kind of get through the configuration and setup of the actual journeys within the tool. But before I dive into getting up through the setup and getting things to do, I wanted to make sure that we cover up a few key sort of, I guess, conceptual points that help you and normally should help you to be successful with the implementation. So every journey, when it starts from the design standpoint of view, it needs to kind of begin with the end in mind. And what this means is when we're configuring the journey, we're trying to think about the outcomes that the customers, well, our customers, or if you're a customer yourself, should be driving. And what it means is it needs to relate back to some of the data points, because usually we ask, if we configure that experience, if the platform runs the automated activities behind the scenes, how do we see the end result? How do we measure that? And how do we identify if everything we've done so far was successful or not? So when we look at the architecting that, then we go, somehow all of these different goals need to relate back to a data point that goes back into the data extension that, or one of the data extension that we've created on the account. When it comes down to the actual practical configuration and setup of the journey, there are a few things to think, beginning with who is the audience. Remember, we've configured data extensions, you've got sendable, not sendable, but when it comes down to journey, the key point of the journey is targeting a specific set of users. And journey itself allows us to do real-time addition of people into that experience. Nonetheless, we're still thinking about how these people would look like, what identifies them. Is it a particular event that's triggering up that behavior, or do we target a specific people in addition to just pure play event? So two examples could be, if we're running a promotion campaign, we might look at the journey being more segmentation driven. So we take customers who might be at the loyalty members. They might be, let's say, on the lowest tier, but they've got missing maybe 50 points to jump up to the next tier. So we'll set up a stretch campaign to incentivize them to do a transaction with the business, and then that will tip them over to move to the next level. So that could be more segmentation based targeting, versus the other one, which is going to be more relevant to us, where the customer's registering into the loyalty program. We want to reflect the fact that they joined the loyalty program, and we want to take them through the welcome journey. That will educate them about the benefits of being part of the loyalty program itself, as well as some additional steps that we may or may not prompt them to complete and accomplish as a part of that experience. So this is our targeting. This is starting to say, who do we target? This is who are our customers and people for that journey. The second part of that decisioning that you need to go through is, what decisions do we need to make when we're navigating through that journey or campaign, regardless how you call it. It's essentially that experience. And you will see today that practically what it means is, when you're configuring some of these decisions, you refer to the data points that need to power up these decisions. So it again takes us back to the data setup, the structures, the relationship that we have in place. And then last part here would be what personalization of dynamic content is required for the actual messages. And that is important, because we now start looking into, do we get a data attributes that need to be done? Do we need to define the content itself and what content? Which channels do we deploy, and so forth. So really it's audiences, decisions, and then content. And then all it comes down to essentially executing the workflow. One of the easiest way I found that when I'm working through the briefs, when I'm working through the data requirements, in order for me to understand and identify what elements I require at the data layer, it means that I'll need to look into what are we trying to achieve. So a couple of examples here where we say we want to target customers in our Silak loyalty tier with weekly spend between $150 and $200 who made 3 purchases in the last month. So again, it's more segmentation oriented, segmentation centric, versus simple journey brief where you've got the customers approved for the credit card, and we want to ensure they activate the card. So we start kind of nurturing them through the experience. We want them to register for the internet banking. We want to start using the card and so forth. So for customers who don't respond on email communications, we want to follow up with SMS communications or maybe push messages if they've got the app. So these are the things that we've got as a brief. Now, I don't expect customers to always be familiar 100% with the data they have in their account, especially if it's an initial implementation. So if you are equipped with constructing the journey that sort of reflects the brief, you would need to have some sort of design done in between that leads you to the actual configuration. But I do refer to the briefs quite often, even if I'm in the implementation cycle, just to ensure that everything that was asked for has been correctly captured, and it kind of makes sense. Because to me, the person who's configuring the journey is almost like the last line of defense to ensure that the design was correctly interpreted into the actual build requirements. So the way I look into design here, I start picking up, all right, so we've got the silver tier, we've got the weekly spend, we've got amount of purchases done in a certain period of time. That's for the campaign. So I need to understand where the tier comes from. How can I calculate a weekly amount that the customer is spending, or where the data comes from, and then number of transactions over a period of time. So these are the points that I will now need to look and figure out where do they come from, so I can start actually creating these segmentation rules. On the right hand side, you can see that we're looking into quite a few data points, right? So you've got the approval element, you've got the activation flag. Somehow we need to understand that the customer did in fact activate the card, whether or not they registered for the internet bank, and then start using the card within the first 30 days. It means that there are some transactions, whether it's spend, adding money to the balance, whatever the flow is, we kind of need to have some understanding of that. And then we'll look into more journey-related behavior. They don't respond on email communications, meaning they're not clicking through the actions, maybe not even opening the emails. So we need to kind of change the strategy of communication to go, actually, we would like to utilize SMS channel or push notifications. If we want to use push, we need to know that they have an app installed. So it's quite more comprehensive and complicated experience in terms of data that comes up just from that 2-sentence kind of brief from the customer. When we start looking into the journey itself, so kind of always ensure that you need to kind of think through these few things. Number one is, how do we initiate? How do we start? So we'll see once we start going through the tool today, there are multiple ways of initiating that starting point. Second bit is we'll look into how do we exit? What is our finish line? How do we finish and complete the experience? You do need to make a distinction between exclusive or repetitive. And what I mean by that is really a simple reference to, can an individual experience the same journey more than once? So if they can, then it's repetitive journey. If they can't, like welcome program, we really want customers to go through that only once. And even if they go up and register for another card, we may not necessarily look at that as a welcome program. So loyalty, always singular, when you join that. And there are a couple of other experiences that could be sort of singular, sort of exclusive, as I call them. When it comes down to repetitive, we look at the same experience multiple times. So take our example where the customers rent a vehicle. What happens if you rent 2 cars at the same time? Maybe you want to get a car for your wife and yourself, 2 families join together, maybe 2 friends, so you're a single person booking 2 cars. Can you go through the same journey twice, like at the exact same time? And that is one of the other questions that needs to be answered. All of these relate to some configuration elements, so you will start seeing them as we go through that experience today. How many messages are required, and what are the personalization, dynamic content, and data requirements to drive them, as well as what channels do we use? So remember that brief on the right-hand side. We want to have an SMS and push if we know that. Dynamic content and personalization, we've sort of start looking into just briefly on what it might look like within the messages. If you go through the actual hands-on guides, because I did enable the links earlier today, then you'll go through some more deeper configuration of these steps and experience what these items could be. But we'll look into more personalization and dynamic content in the next session when we start talking about the specifically AMP script and how it applies for the emails, because we can actually drastically change the entire experience if it needs to. So these are the design decisions that we sort of normally need to go through and understand before answering the journey. Funny enough, exactly the same questions need to be answered when you're configuring the journey, because once you start going through the canvas, you kind of answering these questions as you go. So it's not always a bad idea to think through when you start your work on configuration to ensure that you've got who is in, how do we get them in, what are the exit options, and how do we get people out, exclusivity, repetitiveness, and then what channels, what messages do we need to use to drive all of that and power all of that. The tasks that you're expected to be able to accomplish are limited to few. So you've got number one is very, very important that supporting data model in Contact Builder is configured. You will see when I start going through the Journey Builder without configuration of the data model, you actually don't have access to much of the data. The system gives you full freedom here, but you do need to configure that actual relational model in the Contact Builder, even if you've got that extension already on the account. That will enable Journey Builder to see them and access them and use them within the journeys. Part of the configuration is obviously the configuring the actual activities, so things like sending and communication, making a decision, maybe doing A/B test and so forth. You've got varieties of actions available to you, and then supporting data flows and automation programs. If we need a data, we spoke about that at the first part of this experience. When we talked about integrating the data in, bringing it up. We will talk a bit more about that on the next session as well when we talk about the skill, but almost kind of simplifying it to the point of when you need to add someone into the journey experience, you need to think through who are you adding to that experience. And part of that understanding is you might need to actually implement a supporting automation program that will do some of the data massaging and refreshment of the audiences specifically for your journeys. So that's another thing to keep in mind. What else is there? You've got setup components for API integration. What I mean by that is when you have more real-time journeys that are triggered through maybe landing pages or completely external experiences, then we want to ensure that you understand what it means by setting these up. What do you need to do when you need to go through the steps? And I'll briefly demonstrate it to you. And then last bit is quite important for me. I find that a lot of the consultants or specialists or just users, when they configure it, is one side of that configuration, but the other side, how do you actually approach the testing and validating the journey flow? So we want to look into how potentially empower you to be able to do some of these activities, so at least how to think through that. So these are the things that are kind of like part of what you need to do when it comes down to journey configurations. And for today, what we will do is we'll look into configuring the contact model, which will empower us with the data that we sort of pulled out from these data extensions. We will create a configure a journey and then do a bit of a test and validation to see if the journey works is the way we intended it to do. Okay, this one is kind of finished as a part of the sort of presentation. What I wanted to see more, so give me 1 second. I wanted to share with you one more screen before I jumped into the tool to give you an idea of how do we actually practically might approach that slicing and dicing of the journey, just kind of like sharing a bit of a design flow. So let me just get into that. There we go. So this is a diagram of a couple of use cases. So when I spoke about these, the entry points, the flow, the decision within the journey, this use case is looking into customers who are starting the experience with the registration on the website. So what we're looking here is you've got, let me zoom in a bit more here. There we go. So on the left sort of hand side, you've got the registration flow, which really tells us we want to send a welcome message. So you can see that this is an API-driven experience. That's real time. Once the customer submits the form, we're sending up communication. In our flow, we're starting setting up some of these behaviors, right? So we start kind of configuring the welcome message last time, and we spoke about triggered send. Could be one of these ways to execute that. Either way, it is API, so that's something that we'll look into integrating next time. Then you've got the data that comes in, and then essentially we're looking into file-based integration with Marketing Cloud through SFTP. So we're doing the file drops, they're coming into FTP, we're importing the customer profiles into a data extension, and then we're providing the data in the data extension. It's ready, good to go. Our next step would be to segment the audience. Remember that example that we want to target maybe a silver tier members. Similar here, we want to target customers who are having a birthday in 14 days. So once a day, we can run an automation program. You can see it's daily. That will provide us a subset of the audience. So a filtered, distilled down view of people. And we're adding these people right into the journey where we're providing birthday coupon. So that's our starting point. Now the customers might go and make a purchase and redeem this coupon, and if it happens, we again feeding the data back into Marketing Cloud, into the redeem coupon data extension via API. It may or may not happen, so when we're going up, we send the email, we're waiting for a certain period of time, and then we're making a decision. Was the coupon redeemed? We're consuming that data extension, it may or may not be empty in this case. We're doing a check. If yes, the customer redeemed the coupon, great. We're saying the journey is over, we're done, and we exit. If the coupon is not redeemed, we send a reminder, and then waiting for another 6 days, doing another check, and then sending a reminder number 2. The journey itself is essentially send an email, wait for some time, do the check. If the redemption didn't happen, send a reminder. Again, wait for some time, do another check, and send the final reminder. If I think about the steps that I walked you through here, specifically on the journey, we've got who do we target? This is our audience, people who will have a birthday in 14 days in our database. So that's our entry point. Now, if we think about the flow of the journey, the data that we need within the journey, it's personalization and decisions, right? The second element. That was the coupon redeemed? So I'm looking into another data extension that has a name and it's essentially saying there is a fact or event of redemption of the coupon. So we pull it back in and we're making a check. This one is pretty much the same, and then data-wise we're sort of done. This particular diagram doesn't necessarily drill into the what do we need for personalization, but if you think about that, we need to look into some of the other elements. So when you're sending the birthday coupon, it is important to send the actual code, right? So the code that will be a discount or the barcode that people can sort of scan and use. So we need to look into the where do we get these coupon codes? So in this case, we're getting them from a commerce platform. It's coming up through the file base integration. We're importing these coupon codes into a data extension, and then within the email message, we're allocating these coupons to the audience. So it's a bit of a script block that will go up and say, okay, when you're sending that birthday coupon email, what I'm going to do is I'm going to look into that coupon code allocation using AMP script and do the allocation right within the email in real time. So that flags us here's the coupon that you can use in the store within the next 14 days. That's our personalization requirement. This is the data that powers up actual message. And it's going to be different because every single one of us should get the different coupon codes. The redemption will flow in, but again, here in the reminder, we're going to look into the previously allocated coupon code because we're not going to be generating that new one. And therefore, it's again going back into the same data extension and so forth. So that diagram is kind of like a representation of your thinking through in disassembly in order to come up with what are my build requirements. Now, relating back to everything we've done so far, you need to have a data extensions with import configurations, right? These are our purple items here. You need to have import activity here and here, that they're sitting here. You need to have a template and emails. That's your birthday coupon email. That's the sender reminder and the second reminder. So these are the emails that we need to have. Script, which we're going to address in the next course when we're talking about the actual scripting. But practically all of these things are in place. That filter we didn't necessarily touch on, whether it's a skill or filter activity, again, we'll touch next time, but ultimately it's all here. And what we're doing now is we're pulling through all of that together in that big orange bracket or sort of rectangle. That's a journey. That's what we're doing today. So hopefully that gives you a bit of a clarity, even though we're using a slightly different scenario, but we're gonna still touch base on the kind of like same flow. We've taken into play what we've done to date and start using that for our specific experience. Nice. Let's begin. So actually, before I jump in, Shibu, any questions that might be worth answering right now?
None at the moment, Vlad, but there's one request. I don't know if you have it in the scenario. Do we have like an integration between the Automation Studio to fire the journey entry? Does the scenario cover that?
Yes, the scenario covers it. The only difference is we'll probably have to do it next time because part of the SQL will actually demonstrate to you what triggers how. But we'll do the setup today. We'll do the necessary setup today. And then between today and tomorrow, you'll join these dots together so you will see how one influences the other. Simply because I can't have a automation without certain steps within the journey, within the automation and related to the journey. But it is absolutely part of what we do.
Awesome, thank you.
Excellent. All right, so what we will do first is we'll jump into the journey builder. And the only brief reason is I want to demonstrate to you when you start your experience of creating the journey, one element is why do you need that data to be configured in the contact builder. And then you will see once we're going through that, what are the steps that you need to go through later in the actual contact builder to configure these items. Our experience, we're going to look into 3 different journeys, but we are configuring only one. So today for us, we'll start with a more complex one. We'll call it a rental feedback. And according to our scenario brief that is linked in the document, what we want to do is we want to go and ask customers who just completed the rental about their feedback. So we're asking them to pretty much fill out the survey from the email using the link in the email. Can you please tell us, how it works for you? Was it good? Was it bad? Maybe we lost the keys at the start, took you an extra hour to leave the depot, whatever the cases might be. We're asking for that journey feedback. We know that in order for us to trigger that, customers are returning the car. So we know that the rental is complete, and pretty much we're flagging up that experience based off that. In order for us to nominate people who will go through that experience, we will use exactly as asked the Automation Studio. We will segment customers who's got completed rental yesterday, and we will send the communication to them today. So we're assuming everyone who finished their rental experience yesterday, they dropped the car, because it could be through the different time of the day. What we're doing is we're automating the flow of the journey based on, let's say, 9 o'clock every single day for people who finished the experience yesterday. So that's the way we're building up the flow. If you start configuring the journey in the journey builder, you will see that you've got 3 different options to go through. One is a multi-step, which probably is most common one, and that's the one we're going to construct. Single send, so in our case, what you can think about is promotional campaigns. Something that just need to be, I've got the specific requirement for the audience, I've got a single message to send, we build out that 2 components, join them together, done the send, off we go. So it's more, think of that as like a batched approach. And then transactional, which is really a sort of a similarity to when you complete the registration, we send you the confirmation. When you make a booking, we send you the confirmation that you made a booking. When you picked up the car, we'll send you a note to say, don't forget about, thank you for picking up the car, enjoy your journey, don't forget that you need to be back at certain date and time at particular location according to your booking booking details. So these are the experiences. If you look into the more of the retail example, then if you buy and make a purchase online, the order confirmation receipt would be the transactional example that will fit very well. So we'll start with a multi-step journey, if I want to jump just one step ahead of anything before continuing with doing the actual configuration here, is I want to look into decision. So one of the things that we're going to go through is, you will see there's plenty of entry points that I'm going to talk about quickly. You've got activities within the journey, that these are the steps that we're executing. These are the almost outbound actions that we perform, similar to Automation Studio activities, right? These are things that happen. So sending up an email communication, push notification, maybe WhatsApp message, SMS, whatever the case might be. We can add them into advertising audiences, which is, if it's provision on the account, I can do that. And then there are these things called flow controls. So these are the decision checkpoints within the journey flow that help me to kind of personalize the experience for a customer. So in our case, we would want to make a decision about, customers. We send them, remember the first step would be, we'll send them the feedback survey ask. Once we enter that journey, then we'll wait for some time. And what we'll need to do is we'll need to check, have they provided the feedback? So that's our number 1 check. And I'll skip the message entirely here, because what I'll do is I'll say, okay, let's do a very simple drag and drop. I'll call it request feedback. Not going to configure it, I'll just leave it blank, and you can see it's gray. So I'm kind of crafting my draft version of that. Then, as we discussed, we need to wait for a certain period in time. So we'll wait by duration. Actually, I don't need that activity because the system will add one. And then what we want to do is we want to make the decision split. So I'll wait for some time, make a decision split. So here is say, was the feedback provided. Okay, so the point of the flow, I'm starting on the left, going from the left to right, that's normal flow. I'm coming to the point where I need to make a decision and the path splits. So path 1 would be something we'll say, yes, the customer provided the feedback, and I'll make a note on that, so I'll annotate as I go. And these are the good practices as you go, just making sure that you're not just leaving path 1, path 2. Leave some hints that sort of signify the decisions that you're building up. So yes, feedback provided, and then the remainder will say no feedback. All right. Why is that handy? Because when I start navigating through these, instead of seeing path 1 and remainder, I'll actually see what drives towards path 1 decision versus towards path 2. Now, if I want to actually configure something, I'm going up into my edit flow, and you can see there are 2 items. Journey data is everything that we provide in the entry data extension for the journey. So when we nominate the audience, when we choose our customers who completed the rental activity in the last, in the last day, literally yesterday, and then we include additional fields in the data extension, all of these fields will be available to us here. And they're not changing throughout the journey. So far, we have nothing, and therefore it's an empty selection. Now, a second part that is called contact data. Significance of that is this is all the data that is configured in the contact model. Remember at the start I said, because we haven't done anything, there is not much here. And even though, look at that, there's plenty of items that are sort of standard system generated data sets. So if I look at the email data, you will see it goes into email demographics, it has a list of attributes. These are all the attributes that configured at the profile and preference attributes within the email studio. So system can recognize them. It can go up and look up and say, oh, actually, you know what? I can pull up some of these details because they sit at the all contact level. And it's not just all subscribers, it's because the all subscribers are exposed through contact framework. We have access to these attributes. But they might not be the ones that I need for this journey. They might be completely irrelevant, and they are coming up from my top level business unit. So therefore, for my particular business unit experience here, all of that is meaningless. Okay, going back, I'm going to look into what I have from maybe Mobile Connect data, which is our SMS channel. So again, we've got demographics, and I've got a standard set of attributes that is configured in addition to some of things like a first name, maybe, or anything else I may or may not have added. Again, they kind of are useful, but not at all for my particular experience. And if I'm going to continue exploring that, none of these data feeds will actually give me anything useful. So in order for us to correct that, what we're doing is we're going up into the contact builder and configuring some of these elements to make sure that we can consume and configure these items. So for now, what I will do is I'll just use some fields so I can save that configuration, and later on we'll just come in and update that. So the way I'm doing it is I'm dragging the attribute to the right. I'll just say is not null. Click done, and I looked into the summary. So basically it says if yes, the feedback is provided. If the first name is not null, everyone else goes into that path. I can add more paths here if I need to. So this is not just two splits. You can have 2, 3, 4. It's up to 10 or 20 supported. And remember, as I said, why would you want to make an annotation? Because as you hover it, and you can see it on the canvas as well when it's sort of blacked out, it actually tells you what are these different paths. So what I will do is I'll save the journey right now as a draft. It saves it. I can organize it, move it into the folder, but from my perspective, what I will do, I'll just go into the contact builder, and I think I did have it open. Yeah, there we go, to save a bit of time. So remember, we worked in Contact Builder partially, but we haven't done any configuration in data design. We went into the data extensions, we configured some folders, we configured some data extensions, we populated some of them, or all of them, depending on how far you went through the practical sort of guide. But essentially, we've got things in the account. We do have them in the inbound data, so we've got some data extensions sitting down here. You've got additional data, and I even configured the triggered data extension for triggered send last time. So all of that is here. It's just funny enough, it's not exposed, right? So, and that's what the point of the data design is. Now, we're taking these data extensions and putting them into relational view here. I can start with create attribute or create attribute group here. Doesn't matter. Each of these circles represents a logical, once again, logical grouping of the data points. So I'm gonna just go up and configure some of these groupings for us together to create and what I call is like plug these data extensions. So they are now becoming exposable and visible to the Journey Builder. There's one extra element that I need to do if I'm configuring the data model. I steal off the sort of belief that the populations are important. Without going through complications, how they work, why they're important or not, I know that we've got a customer data extension that I should be pulling up some details from. So I'll go and choose that customer data extension as being my population. I need to relate contact key with the customer key, so I'll choose that, click that, and the system joins the dot. So my relationship is between the contact key and the customer ID in this data extension. That links the DE for me, and the population will be created and configured. Practically what I've done, I've said there is a data extension in my account that contains a master list of all my people that I want to talk to about marketing on transactional sense. And it has some of the key elements that I may or may not use later down the track. I might add additional identifiers and so forth, but essentially I said this is my source of people that are in my database. If I go back into the data designer, you will see that it is exposed under population, tells me how many attributes I've got, but it's not adding them to the attribute groups. And that's one very important distinction to make. Often when you start configuring the data model, if you link the data extension on population side of things, you no longer need to link it in the attribute groups because system treats them, and this is the starting point. Essentially, you kind of link them right here in the middle. And we now need to start relating data back to that data extension. So I'm going to start with creating the attribute group. Let me just look at my guide to see what sort of values I used. So it's more or less consistent with what you might be able to go through if you get a chance. So we're going to call it loyalty membership. And let's say I'll just use still kind of like a profile image. All of that is semantics, visual, but similar. The system provides me configuration. So you will see context on the left. That's really essential center point. And now I can either create new data extension or link the existing ones. And I'll start here. I'll go and say, okay, I don't need the contact key just yet, right? I need to find what configuration I'm doing. Sometimes it does have that, doesn't quite reset the frame, so I'll cancel it and start again. My data extension that I want in the loyalty is the loyalty profile, so the loyalty member. I relate it back to either contact key and customer ID, or I can go back and link. That's where the population comes in play. I can go and say, well, actually, I will use the population, say customer ID, and link it back to customer ID. I do have cardinality. Practically, doesn't really make any difference, but in this case, I know it's one-to-one, so I'll just save that as is. The system will give me a prompt. Absolutely understand that whatever I'm saving has an influence and impact, and we're just gonna plug it in and make it work. So the population is configured and the loyalty profile is now linked to that. So now if I want to go back into the journey, you will find that I've got the loyalty membership item and I can go back to my attributes and actually use them for my decisions. That's not all. So it's a good start, but it's not all. So let me crunch a couple of others. We need transactional, customer transactions. So I'll just put these like that, create. When I said you start from scratch, it is more or less true, but I'll show you in the next dialogue that there is a way to actually bring up some of the details or templates for the data extensions. So in this case, I'm going to use, what do we connect? The booking. Okay, so again, I'm looking into the contact key, looking into the customer ID, and this one is a one-to-many. Practically, we plug that in. Next, we'll do the rental. Booking is vaguely used in our sort of flow, but nonetheless we're going to do that. So one of the things you see, the reason I used it as well, is you don't have that button in the middle, which is totally fine. You click on the drop down here and you click link, and it's same sort of experience that you're going through. So again, we'll use the hold on, not the journey data, we need the inbound and we need rental. So remember, our experience is we're going to use the customer ID. Again, we're connecting one-to-many because there could be multiples. We want to look at the rental feedback. So what we're doing is we're connecting customer to the rental. So we now know if I'm going into the journey, what is my rental history in a way. I can unwind the data back. And then the other extra element that I want to plug in, and you can see that I'm now linking here on that add relationship instead of going up to link, because my rental feedback is not actually tied back necessarily straight to people, to individuals, but it does have a rental ID. So if I looked in my data extension, you will see that my rental feedback has a feedback ID, which is a system generated identifier for the record. Let me just do one on here. You've got the rental ID, and then provides the score category. So there's nothing really that tells me who actually provided it, but I know that rental will give me that detail, and that's exactly it, right? So we're now relating almost like a foreign key relationship, and we'll say it's one rental will have a single rental ID, so they're sort of united nicely to each other, and that provides us the element of feedback. So now we would be able to say yes, the customer did provide the feedback, or they did not provide the feedback. All right, when it comes down, we should be able to see 3 items here. And there we go. So now you can see that from the individual, I can go look into their bookings, I can access their rental, and then through the rental, I can actually get down to the rental feedback data points. And because now all of that is connected in the data designer, you've got extra points here, and you can see as I start going through, the system start adding them up here. So I've got customer transactions, even though it's not necessarily displaying some of these elements. The reason for that is the front end is a bit separated from the back end, and we're doing a lot of caching. And that's one of the other things to demonstrate to you. If you're doing that and you need to double check something, anything, you just click refresh of the browser window. When it comes back to you, you should see all of these attributes that we've just added coming down on the right hand side as well, because that's your contact data when you go into the journey and you start choosing all of these elements all together. Okay, so if I look into customer transactions now, you can see that I've got rental, booking, and if I go through the rental, I can actually access the rental feedback, right? That's the third data extension that we had. So all the data is plugged here. I can access them. Loyalty membership is available too. And I can go and actually see all of these different attributes. So that's essentially what we've done is we use the data extension that we had and plug them into the system. Now I've got one more that I want to do is I'll call it journey tracking group. And I use that item. This is my auxiliary data extension. It may or may not be in your design, but quite often I find that it is convenient to have a supporting data extension for a journey if I want to keep track of some of the decisions that I do within the journey. So we'll find, just kind of finding the name, that's a rental journey track. I've created the DE for that. Similar story, I do have the contact key and I do have the customer ID that I just want to plug them in. It might be one-to-one, one-to-many. Again, practically it doesn't make much of a difference. But even though, even if I choose one-to-many, from the platform standpoint of view, not much of the distinction could be done, because activities that I'm going to be performing will behave in a way that they will overwrite all the data in the data extension using one of the individuals that goes through that. Nonetheless, so practically we've got few data extensions connected. We've got 3 additional groups that we created in the attribute sets. So we've got 3 attribute groups, which is great. And now we can actually proceed to the journey builder. And I will close the previous one and just navigate from here. For the exact same reason, I want to make sure that by the time I reach the journey builder view, the front end is loaded with the latest data that we have in the contact model. So we've got that sort of configured and plugged.
While that loads, there's a question from the team on population. Like, I know you showed that earlier. So there's some confusion on like when do we use population versus attribute groups?
Good question. Population, if you think about that, that's a master list of people. As I said before, think of the database. In our space, it was data table called customer. We effectively said this single D data extension contains all people that we can communicate with. Practically, there is an element, everyone that you add into that data extension is exposed to the platform without any further things or activities, and it's consuming account utilization for the contacts. So there could be a risky element, because there could be customers that you never communicate with, not market to. Maybe there are exemptions, exclusions and whatnot. So that's one of the decision points. But practically, it's almost saying this is my list or my database, or one singular place where you go for all details of an individual. And practical use case for that would be, you can include the email address, you can include mobile phone, you can include any other attributes, and then they remain available to all the journeys without you going up and creating copies. It's a good practice to contain the personalization data, the decision data against the individual into that single sort of place. Think about it as like demographics, profile attributes, preferences, like they're good elements to kind of have that in that place, related back to the contact key. Your starting point in the journey is always a contact key. And then, as you've seen, the system kind of unwinds the data relationship for that, data model, go from contact key to the next contact key to the next contact key. If you're relating them sort of transactional data sets, then the contact might not be there. But again, every single data point will somehow end up being connected to an individual, even though through like a step in the middle. The attribute groups are more transactional in nature. So things, purchases, bookings, visitations, appointments, like anything that you kind of perform and do. It could be a third layer where you things like products, vehicles, like tools, whatever. So these are extra points that kind of fill up the data space. And if you think about kind of like customer centricity, our contact model is centered around an individual. Then that's your kind of like immediate relationship, is that the population is individual, represents a human being. Then you go one level around that, or one layer around that. These are your transactional data points that directly relate to what an individual does. So I can make a visitation to the website, I can open an email, I can make an appointment, book a car, rent a car, return the car, like all of these events or sort of behaviors, right? And then if I want to get to the third layer around me, would be a data that sort of adds extra sort of details around these events. So if I'm talking about the cars, what type of car? That's the thing that is not directly related to me as an individual, but has that intermediate connection through that rental. So I rented a car, and it was maybe a Jeep or a sedan, and a few other details. What color do I have a preference of? Is it 2-door, 4 doors? Like all of these things that come up, they're not related to me individually, but they still add extra understanding and context to the events that surround me. And I think that's really practically as a good practice. If you go beyond 3 levels of relationship, you should really ask the question, why we're doing that? Because the more complicated data schema is, then the poorer performance that you will get in the end. And it becomes really impractical to maintain and manage that. So you kind of need to think of like, there's got 3 tiers of data sets that you should be plugging in. If you go beyond 3 relationships on the right hand side, then something is not quite right. You shouldn't be that detailed. Always keep in mind, and I think one of the other things, I know it's a bit more than what you asked, but one of the other things is we are not doing the true best practice entity relationship diagram. In some cases, you will find that it's actually better to denormalize the data sets, maybe merge them together, create some duplicates, because we are looking at the marketing view of data. We want to make it easier for marketing users, people who build up these requirements and details, are marketers. They're not data architects. They're not looking at IT view of the world. They're looking at the people who transact and interact with their brand. And therefore, for them, it should be easy without trying to kind of think through multiple layers of dimensions, how to derive to people who booked and didn't actually rent a particular type of vehicle in the last month and may not have a promotion sent to them at the same period of time. Like, these are the questions that they would be looking to answer. So hopefully it helps. Populations are essentially individuals, and then everything around them is attribute groups and attributes. That's you kind of defining. All right, the flow that we're going to go through, I'm not presenting you a scenario, but just talking through that. And as I said, you've got the scenario in the guide, so you can always look into that. There are a few elements that we need to construct. I'm going to try to open the last page, sort of like last view of the journey. So when we start, one of the requirements was the marketing team would like to introduce the concept of control groups. And if you're not marketing in person, you don't necessarily know what it means. It's basically a subset of audience that when we put into marketing activities or marketing experiences, we want to try exclude from the mainstream activities that we do. So things like sending incentives through the emails, like giving you discounts and so forth, and actually compare, if we don't do any marketing activities, will these people behave in the exact same way as mainstream audience that we targeted for that activity? It kind of provides ability to qualify and justify the investment, the spend, because if you're providing promotions and discounts, you're essentially spending on behalf of the business. You're kind of discounting the value of services and goods. And therefore, as someone who's sitting at the C-suite will be saying, well, why are we doing these discounts? What do we get out of that? And more to that, if people are still transacting in the exact same way as if we don't give them discounts, then what's the point of discounting the business, and so forth. So that's kind of like where that requirement comes up. And in our case, what we'll do for that, and I'm intentionally just jumping into architecting the journey. So I'll do the draft of the journey, and then I'll get back to the entry source and talk about that as well. So what we'll do is we'll use the, I think it was called random split here. There we go. So at the very start, we'll use the random split activity before we send any feedback. And in essence, I should say, sorry, maybe it was not at the start, maybe it was here. For some reason, it doesn't like me to do that, so give me 1 second. That happens. All right, let's keep it there. All right, so I'll keep it this way, actually, because I'm just looking into that. That's the right behavior. So what we do is we're going to say, we will choose 10% of people without sending them the request for the survey feedback and see if they will fill it up themselves. So we'll go and say, identify control group. Okay, what we do is we configure that activity to be 10% of everyone who gets into the journey. So 10% of people, when we add them to the journey, will go through 90% will go through the main path, and 10% will go through the additional experience. So we'll be in the control group. So this is our controlling group. They don't do anything. They just exit on the day whenever they get in. We're not sending them communication. Then what we want to do is we want to send the request feedback. Okay, we want to wait for a certain period of time, and will be 7 days on or whatnot, and then we want to do the check where the feedback was not provided. If no feedback, remember our requirement was we want to send a reminder. So we will do an email activity once again. So just say no feedback. We'll do reminder email. And then we will do a similar whether or not survey was completed, and we'll kind of continue on that path. For those that did provide us the experience, we're going to look and say, okay, yes, the feedback was provided. Now we need to make a decision what score was provided to us. So we'll add additional activity here. That will be decision split. In the brief, you will see that we need 3 levels of activity. So we'll have 3 different tiers of decisions. So I'll add another path here straight away. And let me go just look into what are these different configurations that we're going. And it's unfortunately, so we'll go a few items here. And I'm referring to the guide, so it's the same. One of the things we do check is to say there is a score, and then second bit is, are they a member of the loyalty program? And we want to kind of drive depending on who they are and whether or not they're providing us the good reference. We want to invite them to the loyalty program. So let's look into how do we configure it. So I'll say for feedback submitted, we're looking into medium or high feedback, but not member. So what that path would represent is we're getting a medium or high feedback score, and that individual is not a member of the loyalty program. Our path 2 would be low feedback. And that doesn't matter who it's coming from, because we're not necessarily interested in here. And we'll look and say, okay, so for us, in order to configure that one of these attributes, I'll need to figure out what data extension do we use. Again, so I'm going up and saying here, click edit. And now, if I looked into the contact data, if I looked at our, I think it was transactional, so customer transactions, rental, feedback, there's one key element. We go overall score category. And I think in my case, it will be equals high or low. So high, click done. And I do the same score category, equal medium, if I can only spell right. So you can see that we're doing grouping up these conditions. What I'm doing now is I'm dragging all of these attributes, setting up the tests that need to be evaluating the values, and then I need to figure out, all right, so how do we actually link that up together? If I leave end condition, this will never be evaluated to true, right? Because what we're doing is I'm kind of saying to the platform, well, both conditions, but we only have one value, so only one of them need to be in place. And I'll need to change that end to be or. So that's one thing. But I know I'm doing another check. Remember, it needs to be not a member. So that could be another component for me to kind of figure out how do I actually address that. And I'm gonna need to look into that loyalty group, so I can start into the contact data, loyalty membership, loyalty member. How do I tell that person is not a member? Well, the very simple test would be here, because quite often you will come across the decisions that you need to make to say, how do I identify the items where there is no decision, there is no value. So I know that the membership number is not going to be there. So I can say the membership number is null. And what it gives me now is I define and say, well, right now we're saying your score category is high and medium and you're not a member. What I'm doing now is I'm clicking here on the right, okay, and changing that condition to be or. So that test right now tells me I choose either high or medium score and the individual is not a member, right, and null. So that should give me the summary of like, yep, these are the people who are targeting, who I'm targeting. Now, one extra thing you will see is this warning message that tells me, well, you can't quite do comparison, yada, yada, yada. Basically, remember we were talking about one-to-one versus one-to-many relationships. In this case, an individual can have multiple rentals and therefore multiple feedback surveys. And somehow I need to ensure that I'm tying this particular experience to the rental for which I'm sending this survey. Right, just kind of winding back. If I ran 2 times in the last 2 months, one is 2 months ago and the second time is last month, and I'm sending, like we are sending that feedback survey for Vlad to submit for that last month's rental, like let us say yesterday and today is a new month, whatever. Basically, we're looking into say, well, how do we know which particular rental we're asking for the feedback? How do we know which one is exactly the one that we need to go to? Because when the system starts looking into relating the data, there is more than one entry. And it could be potential, it could only have one, but at any point in time, there is a risk of having multiples. So in this case, we need to use what we refer to is an attribute to attribute comparison. And for that, we need to get to the journey data. So I'll save that as is for now. The only other thing is I'm going to come here because journey data for us is not connected yet. Therefore, we need to do some work here anyway. And I'm going to go back into, hold on, just give me 1 second. Push, no. Transactions, rental, feedback, overall scope category, we'll just keep equals low. Okay, done. Similar message, we understand that, that's a problem, totally get it, understand it's not necessarily ideal, so we're leaving it as is for now, and I click done. But what the key point that at least I managed to demonstrate is you've got now 3 different decisions. Now again, I'm going to continue doing some other things here along the way, adding up another decision. So if the person is hit medium or high score, they enjoy the experience, and they have not, they are not the member of the loyalty program, we just send them an email asking them to join the loyalty program. So we'll send an email, say, join loyalty, okay? And I'm just putting placeholders, but that's enough for me to construct that experience. So we'll do a save for now. Then for reminder email, we're gonna kind of think about doing a similar thing. So we'll do a decision, we'll do a follow-up, and we'll start making things through. So what is interesting here for us is we want to bring kind of to the point of we want to make a same decision, was the feedback provided, and then whether we're doing yet another element of test or we want to kind of like do another sort of second reminder, because you can still be not providing any feedback. So it could be the case that you can go flow indefinitely. So for us, one interesting thing that you need to know as an implementation person is in Journey, I cannot go back and draw it, like bring my path here back in time. So interesting thing is the journey always flows from the left to the right. So now if I want to do exactly same design decisions, so to say, I need to say, did you provide a feedback, yes or no? What I want to do is I want to copy the activity. So there's a button for that that allows me to do the copying of the activity. So click on that and I choose to say I want this particular item to be copied into my selection. Why do I want to do that? Is because I don't want to go and reconfigure the same thing over and over again. It's already been done. So now I bring that decision split right over here. Okay, and that gives me straight away pre-configured exactly same attributes as I used before to make a decision. So one of them is yes, the feedback is provided. So what we're doing with the feedback that is provided is we're bringing them back to the second floor, right? So we're joining them up to the top, and we used to have an activity that is called join. So now I take and drag this element right over here. And it does sometimes get a bit crazy in the way how the lines are drawn, but if you think about the flow, we start, send an email, wait for some time, check if feedback was provided. We're going, no, the feedback was not provided. We're sending the reminder email, waiting for some time, coming back, doing the check again, and all of a sudden the feedback is in. So what we're doing is we're going back to the main path. All right, it's always at the top, the main one, or at least I refer to that as the main one, and then the experience continues over here. So I don't need to copy all of that, bring it back in, same configuration. That sort of gives me that sanity of the flow is not exhaustive, and there's little duplication, as little as possible. I also want to look at that as to say, well, practically I don't need to wait here anymore, even though the natural behavior of the system to add these data elements or wait activities all over the place, always review and ensure that you're only leaving the ones that you do need, because once we join the path, that one is irrelevant and I'm going to get rid of that. So it minimizes one extra step. Okay, so we go feedback provided, no, email sent, waiting for some time, checking, yes, we're going up to this path. Then we're going up into decision and figure out, do we need to invite the customer to join the loyalty program, or do we drop that off altogether? So let me see, what else do we need to do? Now, from few other activities that we need to go through, we need to check if, or at least one of the other data extensions is included into the system. And in order for us to achieve that, remember the journey data that I need to make some decisions of. I need to go back into my entry sources. So I saved the version, I've got it ready. What I need to go to is now look into the entry sources. For us, when we start with journey, there are a few options to consider. Number one is we're looking into how do we initiate the start. Very common is data extension. When I choose the data extension, is often referred to activities that are executed through the Automation Studio, and as a result of these activities, we're adding people into that journey experience, and that's exactly what we want. Second bit for us was API event. Remember in the tasks that I listed you in the presentation to say, what are you expected to do? If we want to ensure that the journey is triggered in real time because the customer did a certain behavior, we want to have that API integration, maybe from the commerce platform, from third-party system, doesn't really matter. We can integrate through the API. So then you drag that API event, even though underneath it would still create a data extension, but the way we're thinking about that is it's actually different entry point, and it implies different configurations. If I want to drag that API itself altogether, the system will ask me to go and choose, hey Vlad, which data extension do you want us to use? So it's great, there's nothing here, let's configure it. And the very first step in the configuration will tell me use the data extension. What the system gives me here is the key that I will need for the API integration, and that's something that we might look into when we get to the APIs. And then if I need to make any additional filtering on entry, because you can, you stream a lot of people coming up into the API flow, but maybe the third-party system that pushes the API do not have an opportunity or doesn't have an opportunity to make decisions. So we can actually be even more decisive to say, well, not every individual that's coming through API is eligible for this experience. So we can make some decisions once we start getting people into API before we add them into the journey. We can eject them out before they even start. So the API is not what we need, so I'll cut this one off, but at least it gives you an idea. When we start looking into CRM connectivity on the session number 5, we'll talk about that Salesforce data events, something that happens in CRM, triggers the journey for us. Again, real time, great story. Audiences used in a few cases if you've got extended products, inbound chat, which is really for WeChat. And then the cloud pages is another great experience where you might have a form build up in the smart capture for the cloud pages, as we looked into these landing pages last time. And then once you submit that form, it will add people into the journey for you. It kind of emulates that API event behavior, but you don't need to write any script. And therefore, if the flow is very simple, no complicated activities, no extra handling you need to do. This is a great way of just putting up a simple form. People fill out the form, that triggers the journey, no coding required. Amazing story. So our case would be data extension. Going to go back to what we need to do. We're going to choose the data extension that again I configured beforehand. But for you to know that the data extension that you can select, it has to be a sendable data extension. So I choose that rental survey journey event queue. I have a certain sort of approach for naming. The queue to me means that's my journey sort of trigger, because from the data extensions, when you look into the contact builder, or if you look in the email studio subscribe and data extensions, you don't actually see any association with the journey as such. And therefore I'm having a particular choice of naming convention so I can distinguish them. They sit in a separate folder and they have a specific name. So I can always know that these are the ones that are related to a journey. So I choose the journey data extension. You can see that I've got the filtering ability here as well. And what happens is I can actually relate back to any data points that I have in the system as well. It doesn't give me access to that DE just yet, but it allows me to choose all the other data elements to make a decision. It's good if you maybe using a filter activity, or if you event triggering stuff, even through data extension, like populating the data with in a certain way, and you can't make a decision before adding records in the data extension. That could be a way to kind of say, well, let's do a bit of a check before we get people into the canvas. We actually want to verify that they're eligible for that. So in my case, I don't really need to do anything. I will populate that data extension with a with a query, so I know by the time the data hits that data extension when the records are created, they all are eligible for the journey. So I don't have to worry any more of that. If I click summary, that sort of works well for me. I click done. Fantastic. I'll just click save. So it doesn't autosave, but I don't want to go and reconfigure that every single time. Now you will see there's an extra thing here that it says the schedule. And that's the one that sort of gives me few options and flavors to work with. I'm going to touch on them right away while we are at that, and I'll show you what it means when I was referring to like automation or not automation. So if I want to run this experience once, I can say run the journey only one time. It's sort of similar to that single send, but because the journey have multiple steps, I'm actually sort of more empowered to do like decisions, some activities and whatnot. So put some smarts in that, and therefore it's similar. It could be campaign experience. So one of my practical examples was I had a customer, they gamified one of their key promotions throughout the year. The experience lasted 6 weeks. But what you do is you register before that event, like say 4 weeks before the event. The ad goes everywhere, it's in the media and so forth. You register for that, and then when the campaign starts, it's a certain date. They start it, they run it once. And what happens, everyone who registered up until that point gets into that flow. The journey lasts for 6 weeks. You don't add people at the start anymore. It's literally everyone who registered, they go through that experience, right? So that's a really run once, it's a good one. The second one is it's a recurring journey. And the great thing about the recurring journey is you don't need an automation. And that's why I'm saying sometimes you might have a data coming up into data extension through varieties of ways. So you can feed it through API, you can populate data extension. You can add records to that through queries that run programmatically. So you don't really know when the records are populated and how, but from the journey perspective, you don't care. All you want to do is maybe every 4 hours you want to look into the data extension, get all the new records, and then add them to the journey. In this case, there is no filtering per se, or there might not be. That's why you might have on the DE itself, when you select the DE, you have that contact filter criteria. If not, you simply go and say, well, let's set the schedule to be run whenever. It's kind of like you're defining the automation program, but you're not really providing an opportunity for it to say, I've got extra steps to do. I can run the SQL, I can do the import. You just expect everything already happened, right? And then you go back into that contact evaluation and you'll say, yeah, this is how I want to potentially assess. Do I get all the new ones or everyone who's in the D and so forth? Again, doesn't necessarily work for us because we're kind of looking into changing that to be more automation driven, but there is no automation as such. As I said, I did not configure an automation activity yet that touches that data extension. Therefore, I cannot choose anything. It's grayed out. So that's another element. If you're configuring the journey, you choose the DE and you see that it's grayed out, it means there is no automation program that filters into the DE, that uses query and populates the DE, or imports the data into the data extension. These are the ones that if you have an automation that impacts that data extension somehow through one of these activities, you will see that become active, and then you can go up and choose the program. So we'll leave it for the next time. We will actually go through that configuration and kind of look into how do we do that. For our case, we might even do run once. So if we need to actually activate and run it. So I'll keep it no schedule for now. That's still fine. And all I want to look into next is a couple of activities that will be required for the journey that I need to go back and kind of capture it. Step number 1. When we identify who is in the control group, how would we as a marketers know that the individual was part of that control group flow? So we kind of need to somehow flag that. And this additional data extension that I configured will be exactly what I'm going to use. So give me 1 second. I'm going to go back and to say what we're doing here is we're looking into that update contact activity, which is really a great one for specifically these type of flows where you go and I want to update an activity, update the contact. I need to go into a data extension and flag that this individual is in fact a part of the control group. So going back into my journey data, the tracking DE that I configured before, and I navigate back to the attribute value, and I just say, well, okay, I'll update is control group, and I would say as true. I can add another attribute here, and you can see up to 5, I believe. That was the last time I touched it, and I can go and say this is effectively done or not done. There could be other actions that we need to do, so I'll just say journey completed. Again, this is pretty much done because that individual is not progressing any further. So there are 2 flags that I use. I find that convenient tool when you've got a single type of experiences, or even if you're multiple types, but the data is not stale in the D and sort of refreshed frequently. One of the challenges with this activity, purely for your awareness, is when the system updates that, you can see that I didn't choose an attribute to say who is the customer ID, right? Because in my experience, like here, I don't need to. The system will populate it for me without me explicitly telling what it is. So that's one thing to kind of keep in mind. But what it leads to, if I already have a record for that same customer ID in the data extension, then it will overwrite that. So every time it kind of runs and adds the record into the data extension for that contact key, if you allow more than one, it will always kind of update whatever is the current value. So from my perspective, if I want to track people who come up into the multiple, rentals, I should be kind of somehow staggering the journey in the way that there's only one instance of Vlad going through that experience at any point in time. Even though I might have 2 rentals, I need to still account for that in this case. If not, I might be okay with the fact that both of them flag. So I'll have to kind of deal with this experience. But more from your, without sort of overcomplicating that even more so, this activity does the update, but it updates all records or add a new one for that contact key that is now going through the journey. If you have multiples, whichever one is the last one that reaches that point will effectively overwrite the previous entries and therefore update them for all variations of that contact key. So I'll flag that this is the individual that does go into the control group by the platform, and their experience is pretty much done. So I can potentially get them into an additional journey. All right, so this is main, I guess, flow of configuring and constructing the journey and going up through some of these decisions and whatnot. The system will not be ready for me to do any sense until I configure all of these grayed out activities. So I need to know that, say, if I want to validate or activate, a platform will say, well, hold on a second, you've got way too many things that are red here. So it will enforce that you complete the configuration before anything happens here, before I can progress with any further activities. All right, what I will do is, in order for me to actually do a bit of a test and validation, I'll set up the schedule to be, let's say, recurring. No, actually run once, so I'm not going to activate just yet. So one time journey runs on activation, that's great. So I just need to know that if I don't want to kind of like start the journey, if I want to repeat the journey more than once, then I just don't need to start. In order for me to do the actual test, same way as I would want you to be able to do that, that should be sufficient. Now the request feedback, we did configure the email last time. Interestingly, within the journey, so just more for you to be aware of, you can create emails within that experience too. So once you start selecting these grayed out activities, you can actually go into that whole flow of creating that. Depending on your workflow, I'm finding that creating the building up the actual creative beforehand makes a bit more sense for me. But you can start with a new message and design and build it out right here. I will just go and choose the one that we created, I think, last time. And if not, I'll go into the tricky bit. Okay, feedback survey. So looking into the message configuration steps as well. You need to choose, remember that same configuration of the send classification, the validation, that setup that we've done at one of the previous steps is now applicable here too. So I can actually say, yes, I want to use that. But you do get a chance, if there are other options configured, I can nominate which particular delivery profile or sender profile can be overwriting that. So it's still a bit flexible. Delivery options, usually I'm not concerned about them, except maybe if I need to do some exclusions and publications, so capturing my preferences. Didn't touch that, so I'll just jump through that. And then some of the advanced options, if you need CC or BCC, these are possible to add. Now, risk with these, I always highlight that because quite a lot of people just get caught on that. There are two risks associated with that. Number one, we treat every email as an individual email sent. So if you add a CC address or more than one, then we're going to count as if you send more than one email. So if I've got one CC field populated one value, that's plus one email sent to my send utilization. And that's what we charge for. So that's number one concern to be aware of. Number two is we sending to that CC email address with all the personalization and details that we're sending to a original recipient. So literally, we're finalizing the content for initial sender, making that a copy, and then we send that to the second individual who's in their CC field. Practically, what it means is if that CC individual recipient open the email, then we will record that as a main target customer open that email. If the person on the CC will click through the link, we record it and attribute that to the initial target contact. Okay, so that kind of like two folds. One is utilization. Second one is we tracking the behavior towards initial contact that we're sending to. These are the good things to be aware of. In few cases, very few cases where it might not matter, most of the times it does matter. And therefore, be very careful when you might be told that you need to include that. Just double check and triple check that before you actually populate that, because it is in fact super important from a marketing standpoint of view. All right, configuration is done. The flow here allows me to do the preview of the emails and so forth, very similar. What I'm gonna do for the reminder, we'll drop them off. I'm kind of not fully configuring the journey because I just wanna look into some of the other flows here. Let's say join loyalty, because I wanna get to the point where we actually validate, and I wanna show you how to do the validation of the journey and how to get that configured. So I'll choose select the message and I'll jump into the shared emails because I'm pretty sure I've got that sitting here just for this kind of use case. Okay, loyalty program invitation, so we want to choose that. And the good thing is what I'm demonstrating you is I don't have to go and create everything in the like a copies in every single business unit. I'm very flexible in this case. I've created them once and I shared them down and I can actually access them. So in the same way you can do for your organization when you're configuring that, you don't have to build everything in every single BU. What you find interesting is one of the things while I'm going through that to keep in mind is configurations of the journeys are at the business unit, right? So when I'm configuring that, I'm doing it in the single business unit, but there is a trick. We do have a tool that allows us to export configuration and import in another business unit after that, which is another great thing because quite often you do find the need to copy the journey partially or fully, and you want to get to the point where you don't have to go and manually reconfigure that over and over again. So let me get this configuration in place, and I'll show you where it goes up to. So I think it's a reminder of the feedback. There we go. Just click done. All right, so my emails are configured. Everything here is in place. Okay, save is done, and it is a bit slower for me, but what can I do? Just kind of fight through that. When I'm sharing the screen, everything gets a bit slower. And then when I look at that, there's go save as a template. So that's another thing to show you. If I want to configure that, like maybe it's a welcome program that I want to apply across multiple business units, get multiple brands, that could be a good way to distribute that. You save it as a template and then you create the journey from the template, meaning half the work is already done for you and you're just kind of configuring certain elements that are missing out in your other business units. Now, before I can activate and do anything with the journey, I will be asked to configure the settings as well. That's one extra thing to go. This is going back into, remember these, exclusivity. And how many times can an individual go through that experience? Now, in my case, if I'm going to go and say no re-entry, re-entry anytime, or re-entry only after exiting, this will change how the people can go through that. The first one is you only get once, that's exclusive experience. Re-entry only after exiting is you can be in the journey, you can be added to the journey multiple times, but you can only be there once. So once the first data point that was added to the journey audience is injected into the journey, the second and third and subsequent attempts will not going to be processed and added to the journey until the first one is finishing the experience and exiting out. If I choose re-entry anytime, and every single time you find my entry in the data extension, they're all going to be added into the flow. Right, so I'll choose this one for entry after exit. And then the email address. So remember we were talking about this population. And if I go and say, choose my email address, because I'm sending emails, the system will tell me where should I look for the email for this individual. So I can go and nominate that in the data extension. Well, guess what? My data extension doesn't have it. And if I go back and look at the attributes, none of them include my data extensions. None of them include an email address. These are the things that exist in my data extension itself. So this is what is being added into the journey. Just the customer ID, the rental ID, and the date added. That's it. So no reference. And therefore I have to figure out, okay, I actually need to go from the context. The only way something will appear here is you go into the email addresses, which is your all subscriber keys, right? If the person is there. Or I can go into my customer, right? That was population that I configured, and choose the email field. So that's why I might want to have another reason to have a population, because every single time you go into the journey, you need to specify where it's coming from. And if I'm going to have to go and replicate it all over the border, if, for example, maybe customer changes an email, that's going to be a bit of a drastical change. So I need to ensure that it's always coming up from the contact rather than me going up and distributing all over the places. That's my preference, and I think it's a best practice to go and centralize your data management versus distributing all over the places. In some cases, you will find that it's much easier to do at the journey level because it's a data extension that gets in and throws out, or you need an archiving view of that. So different views, but again, I choose. That's where the second reasoning for population comes in handy for me. I don't have to specify a mobile number because I'm not sending SMS, but if I do have an SMS activity, the system will prompt me to nominate where does the mobile number come from in the exact same way as I did for the email just now. Now, this configuration is done. Remember, one thing that was missing out from the config at the data was how do I tie up my decisions to the rental that I'm being added into the journey. And if you recall it now, we saved that to be, we don't want the attribute that we left out here. So what we'll do is we'll look into contact data, we'll look into the transactions, we'll look into the rental, and then rental feedback. Okay, we can say your feedback has been provided. So we go, all right, the feedback ID is not null, right? So the feedback ID is not null. I can say that overall score category is not null, whichever, but I choose the feedback ID is not null. That's great. And now the only other thing is I need to tie up these rentals together. So I need to go and say, well, I choose the rental ID, and in order for me to drag the attribute here, I need to click that checkbox. So now what I'm going now is going into the journey data. This is my entry data extension, okay? It has customer ID, but it also has the rental ID. That's how I prepared the data, because I knew I will need that. And I drag it back in. So now I'm saying together, for that particular rental ID that I'm adding into the journey, you need to find the corresponding record in the feedback data extension, and the feedback should not be null. So in a way, combining these two together, you see it's an and condition, not or condition. The system should now be able to define and say, great, now I understand what is happening here and how to get down to that a single record for that customer for their specific survey. Okay, and that's how we're going to get that done, and I need to update these bit as well. So here I would go up and do exactly the same change. Since remember I just copied that, so that entire criteria is not relevant here anymore. So I'm going again, customer transactions, rental, feedback, and I'm going, okay, feedback ID. Actually it's not null. Done. And rental ID. equal, because if I don't choose that, it's a text. I can't really drag the attribute over here, so I have to tick the checkbox. Now going back into that journey data, I can go rental feedback and drag my rental ID over here. Done. So saving that here as well. That gives me my data view. Ready. Okay, saving. We've got some time to go through that. I'm not 100% fully configuring the journey, just to save a bit of time here. Imagine this is the final view. Imagine this is everything good to go, ready to try. What we need to do is you need to click activate normally. And the system before the activation, it will go through the test and validation. This is testing and validation of the journey itself. So what happens when you click validate? I'm just going to go through the validate step before I go anywhere further. It goes up into, looks at your creative, looks at the personalization, AMP script within your creative. Does the check that fields exist? You didn't type all the function names and all that sort of stuff. It goes up into the decision points and says, well, do we have all the data connected in the right way? Nothing is broken, relationships still exist, because once you configure that, the schema, you can go and delete the data extension somewhere within the contact model. So the system will ensure that before you take off, literally here, it does check all the sanity points to ensure that you're good to go and ready. What we want to do next is we want to go and say, well, if I click activate, the activation will go and say, now I can return to draft, or I can go and test the journey. If I click activate button, it will tell me you can now activate, or you can test or return to draft in the same way. I'm just not going through the activation because I want to preserve that version for further enhancements. Now, practically, I've done configuration. How do I test that the flow is correct? The experience that we have today, if you look at that, you've got 1 day here, 1 day there, 1 day here, 1 day there. So that's one story. Second story, what is important is we've got these data points, we've got that data point, and we've got these data points. So if our scenario is kind of to verify what's happening, usually you kind of need to understand how the testing works. The test of the journey allows you to choose up to 10 people from your audience and push them through the experience, ignoring the timing activities. So it will not wait for 1 day, it will just literally just go through the flow. You can choose to send messages or not to send messages. It will apply the data decision criteria for you, and therefore it will give you the path, probably more from the data point of view, whether or not the customers went through the right path or the wrong path. Okay? In some cases, works fine. So in my case, if I just want to have, all right, what would be the test data set that I need to prepare in order for me to verify that the journey design that I've constructed here works fine. And if I looked at that, one really good way to think about that is, and by the way, I said the control group, it will be ignored because it doesn't take into account like random splits or control group, which just goes in the first path. So we will get to the point of, we need to figure out how many, individually unique records do I need to create in order for me to take that flow and effectively experience all the potential paths. So if I'm kind of looking into the way I'm approaching the test setup is I take each end where you've got this exit, stretch them into one line, and effectively this is how many points or data points I might need to create in order for me to test that journey. So I'm looking here is I've got identify control group. Let's say if this one ignores the exit, what I'm going to go for is go here. That will split into 2 items. So I'll go top one is the first one. So I need to get to the point where my test case that will be across the data points has to say yes to these. It has to choose the first path here and therefore exit on that flow. If I go into this path, right? So again, I need to go 2 options, but that's a challenge. If the test flow is running up pretty much at one go, there's not going to be a chance for me to go and say no here and yes there. And therefore, I'm assuming once the system evaluates yes, because this is pretty much a duplication of that setup, I can probably ignore that. If you truly want to test your entire journey, then potentially what you need to do is you're changing the dates to be maybe minutes, and that's normally how you would go. You'd say this is going to be maybe 2 minutes or 1 minute or whatever that is. Then you wait for the feedback, and the first time the data goes in says no, the feedback is not provided. Then you leave yourself here maybe 5 minutes. You go back to your data set, update that in the contact builder and change it to be yes now, and the system will have to go and get the person here. It's not a bad idea, but it's significantly more time consuming. So the very first test of the journey should be set up the data set in a way that you can predict a certain outcome, that you expectable outcome. Push them into the journey and then see if your expectation have been matched, right? If the platform did in fact take people into the right paths according to your test plan, according to your data set. So if I'm going to be testing here, what I'm interested in is I've got yes feedback goes and gets into that first path, then you go yes feedback goes into the low feedback, then here any other value goes here, and then no feedback. I only need four iterations to go, because if no, it will come here and it will come to no. I don't expect the join to work in my test case anyway, in this case, because I know that the system is just going to go run through all of them and get it done. So I'm going to go back into data extensions and update the entries. So what we need to do is we need to go into the rental survey journey event queue. Okay, I'm going to keep that open so I can demonstrate it as I go. And I'm going to provide you like a view of how I'm doing that. Now the other side is, especially when you're doing tests, remember every single time we send an email, even if it's a test email, like in a way testing sense, still we're utilizing a location on the account. So quite often I don't really spend a lot of time trying to blast a lot of emails just to test them out. In this case, when I'm using test of the journey experience, I'm really focusing on making sure that my data decisions set up correctly. That's the main focus of the test. If I want to look at the personalization and I take the email and go through the send preview and I validate every element of that email separately. If I want to do holistic journey, once all of these separate activities and almost like unit tests are complete, then I go and set up the audience. I've got a big matrix for that normally. What are my expectations? Get in, and then if I need to do some activities, I do. And then at the end, I track it through the spreadsheet and then consolidate and say, this was the experience. I kind of took an actions on behalf of the customer and tracking down if everything worked the way it should be. So it's almost like 3 different ways of tracking through that. So let me get back to my contact builder. I'm gonna go, and I'm using contact builder here because in Email Studio you don't have a way to input data in the user interface, same way as you will see I'm gonna be doing now. So 2 points I've got at least. Number 1 is my entry journey. So I'm gonna go into the journey data. Remember that rental queue data extension. So I'm gonna jump here, and as we discussed, right, I said 4 items. So what I will do is I'll create a customer ID. So I'll go, I'll just do uppercase here. So test 001, rental ID, rental 01, date edit, let it be today, doesn't really matter. Click save. Add, so test 02, rental 02, save. If you prepare it, then you can import a file. That's another fast way of doing that. So again, depending on how you kind of craft and work with that, take whatever is easier for you. Until 004. Okay, so 4 entries. Now for all of these, I kind of need an email and so forth, so I'll have to create potentially a customer, but let's just pause here. My next test before I'm going into anywhere else is going up into the feedback. And if I click on the feedback, just to remind you, we're using the rental feedback data extension. So I need to go and relate back the rental and relate back the actual feedback itself. So I go, I need one case when there is nothing. So let's take, in this contact data extension, test number 1 is going to be my use case where there is no data, no feedback. So I'm not going to be bothered doing anything. This is pretty much as I need to go for that particular flow. For my test 2, 3, and 4, I need to provide the feedback, and therefore I need to create the rental. Cool. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go into my data extensions folder, find my inbound data, and I'm going to go into the rental. Same story, creating records. Just need key elements here. Key element is rental 002, customer ID going test 002. No booking, vehicle no, 01. Doesn't really matter. Everything else is pretty much optional for us, except maybe something else. Booking ID, not start date. Let's just do, because I think I've got the dates mandatory. So we'll do Monday to Tuesday. Duration of days 1. Malaysia, these are the ones should be fine. I did put more constraints than I thought I did, so there we go. Luckily you only need 3. Rental 03, test 003, vehicle 2. Let's push this one to be from Wednesday to Friday, 2 days. And then we'll do one in the past just because we can. Rental 04. We need to be correct. Vehicle 3. Start date. Let's say it was at the start of the month. It was for 5 days. And we save that. Okay, now we've got these in place. And the only other thing I need to do is get the feedback. So rental feedback. Again, I'm showing that in real time because I think it's important that you see. It's not very difficult to do it if you need to do it on the fly, but it is important. So, feedback 002, actually 1, rental 02. So the second one is going to go the top path for us. So we won't get to the point, because all of them have the feedback, right? So that will kind of skip that point. What we're going to go into that decision tree next. So discard changes and effectively say you've got medium or high feedback, low feedback, and no feedback. I'll just use and assume that if I do medium or high, but practically now I actually should have done extra case, one with a medium feedback, one without the medium feedback, but you get the idea, right? So that's going to be enough at least for us to go. So overall score category. And maybe what we'll do is we'll do high. Remember, case insensitive, right? So it doesn't matter high, low, it will still work. Now, the other criteria for us should have been whether or not they're a member or not. I skipped it in the setup when I was going through that, but ultimately, actually, did I? Because I want to double check that. Membership ID is no. So we want that to be invited. So the person number 2 is going to get invited. The second one was going to go rental feedback. What did I do? Add record. Feedback 2. Rental 03. We'll do low. Okay. And then maybe what I want to do test is if I provide a medium feedback, but I will go into having a membership record for that person. So let me do it this way. Feedback 03, feedback rental 4, and I'll go medium. So practically that should go in the first path, but then what if not? That should go into a remainder path for us. So in this case, I need to go into loyalty member. Now, hopefully I've got all these things right. And that's where preparing the data ahead of the time would have been much more joyful right now for me. So I'll do member 001, customer, so it's going to be test 004, tier, we'll put them on the silver, join date, let's put them to be 1st of March 2020, and we'll save that. Okay, so now I've got 4 test cases that I should be able to test out. Let's kind of try that out. So I'm going to go into validate again. I can't do the test as you see because I already start clicking through the experience. The system will tell me now, no, Vlad, you can't really do that. And we are just in a good timing to go through and kind of complete that nice experience. Oh, come on, there are no errors. Everything should be good. But it does take a bit of time, and the more activities you've got on the canvas, the more stuff you've got, the longer it might take. There have been a few questions around in the past around, you know, what's the best practice for how long the canvas should be, how big it should be. There are some practical limitations because remember, everything you work with is in the browser. So kind of be considerate of, if you stuff a lot of things here, it's difficult to kind of work from the user experience and kind of like handling UI. But the other side of that, your journeys have to be thought about being an atomic interactions related to an event that triggers them. Right? So you're not trying to create a 6 months or 2 years worth of experiences. If you have a journey that needs to last for that long, you're actually looking at the bigger life cycle journey, but practical implementation will have to split them into multiple stages. Quite often consideration would be, if I get the experience like that, how often or how likely that element of the journey to change, that element of the journey to change, or this element of the journey to change. Because if it's getting to the point where it actually is, has a potential to change frequently, then you want to minimize the amount of things that you have to go. There is a life cycle of the customer. When you add them to the journey and you start changing the experience of the journey, you will actually have to create a new version. So you can't just go up and modify and hack and do a lot of stuff. So quite a few configurations there that are considerations that are important. But again, they go a bit more over the design, and I'm just kind of sharing with you how we're going to do that. So going back to the test, I've clicked on the test. It goes, do you want to choose the context, and then send type. Do you want to send an email or not? And then test behavior, review how activities are simulated while test. So let's go with the choose the test. So number one is I'm going to go and choose all 4. And it allows me to get all of my 4 ranges. You can see that I only can select up to 10. So if you have a data set of 20, you probably need to run the test twice. Then you go into the send type. In my case, I'm not interested in sending emails, but you can send only test messages, right? So that's another thing that we want to kind of, do we want to test or not? Test behavior. So we're looking into mimic active journey behavior in the random split, no email sent, and skipped and so forth. So it tells you exactly how it's going to run. Now, I'm actually a bit concerned about this because I didn't account that we're going to have a skip items, but it's a bit of a newish thing for me because last time I touched it was behaving slightly different, but nonetheless, it is what it is. So we'll go with that. No emails sent, wait by duration, we're skipping them. So as I said, we're not waiting for anything. Decision split, it will mimic active journey behavior, which means it will apply, evaluate the data. It will not update contact, so that update contact in the rental service is not going to happen. And then for joins, it will actually do the join. So if we would be able to kind of have some criteria that doesn't rely on the data being updated, it might have joined the path for us. Okay, so that's a really good sort of summary for you. You know what's happening. You get to the point, if you need to change, you can, and then all you need to do is just click start the test. The system does a good kickoff. The windmills are going to start running, and then it will tell you when it's all sort of completed and whatnot. So by the time it kind of reaches up the point where all of these activities are done, the great thing of that test is it actually visually tells you which particular path any contact went through. So test number 1, we said what was there, it's no feedback, right? So we didn't create any feedback, and we went through the point of no feedback. So you can see that the green path that the customer was taken, it's exactly how we expected that to be. So it's like, okay, that's great, that makes sense. What about contact number 2? And bummer, went through a test control. All right, so that didn't happen the way I was hoping to. Test number 3. Now, from memory, test number 3 providing us the low feedback. So we've got the low feedback. Yep, worked out really well. And then test number 4. Let's again get down to the control stuff. So okay, I'm going. Yeah, that sort of gives me something, but not everything. No, and that probably would have been better if I didn't design a control group early on and done it differently. But I can go and rerun it. Now, one extra thing I do want, in fact, highlight, because that's another consideration that you want to know. Even though we said it's 90 to 10% split, and we took 4 people, and if you look at the result of the test, we got literally 50-50 split. It is because the randomization here works in an odd way. We're applying a randomness at the 1-to-1 level. It's almost like, think of that as when you take an individual, we're going to throw the dice, and we know that the likelihood of getting 10% will be, well, likelihood of getting into the path B will be 10%. But it could happen that 10% going to go and stack together one after another one, right? So that is why when you need to have a bit more precise control of the flow, and when you're doing division of audiences into segments or you might call them batches and whatnot. You might actually create a data split, like a decision split, and prescriptively assign through the queries what is the path that the contact has to go through. And this way, you will have much more control over how this split is going to work. So that's, again, this is great because it's randomness. Once you surpass the 1,000 people in the journey, this ratio will become as close as it gets to that true 90 to 10 ratio. But until then, you might see that odd result in terms of how figures are distributed, because as I said, the randomness is aligned to overall population, how many times we're going to roll, what's the likelihood of getting that second path coming up in the results, and it's 10%. So if I want to go back to the test results, I looked at that and go, let's do another roll and see if that this way it will kind of give me a better likelihood, because I want to see someone who's providing medium feedback. I just want them to go into the remainder. Remember, the people who has to go into the medium flow, but then they are already a loyalty member. And if I remember, just double check who was that. This is our test number 4. So the 4th individual should go into a certain path here. Set of the test. Okay, first one goes into no, that's fine, we know that. Second one this time, instead of test, went through the top exactly how we wanted it to be or expected it to be. Remember, it was feedback provided, it was high score, and this person is not a member, so it is correct. Third one went into the low feedback, very much like this last time, and the 4th one went into remainder. Yeah, there we go. So you can see on 2 different rolls, we've got very different results. In the second one, we've got no one coming up into the random split and going into path 2. But this is exactly how sort of I wanted that to go. It matches precisely my expected behavior. So now I know that the results of the configuration is correct, and the data flows in the way that it needs to be going. So in this case, I'm not activating again, returning to the draft. I'm going to save that and leave it up until next time. Now, the only other thing that I wanted to go through, which we've got about 5 minutes or a few more, just kind of like 2 minutes before I go. So when you create the new journey, if you will see what would be an interesting way, like comparing the multi-step that we went through from, for example, single send journey, where I want to have an email. So you will see that the system prescriptively limits you to what you can do within this journey in terms of canvas. So it tells you that you can choose the data extension that your source audience is. It will get you to choose email because we selected an email. If you choose SMS, you go through the SMS configuration and then define when you want to send that. So it's almost like, as I said, it's a promotion sale. We've got a special offer. We want to target a certain group of people. Let's set it up. Define the time and date. Boom, it goes up. No problems. A great benefit is if you've got Einstein activities as an option, so you can choose in terms of engagement frequencies and send time optimizations within the journey, within that single send journey. But as you can see, there's no any other activities available on the canvas. And these are good for ensuring that we sort of, correctly targeting individuals. Maybe you set it up to be sent at 9 o'clock in the morning, but then the send time optimization can be used to say, hey, hold on a second. For some people in the audience, it's actually the worst time because they never open it historically at the time. But if we send it at 5 p.m., they're definitely going to do that. So it will do the job for you without making any decisions. So you can set it up almost like at 7 o'clock in the morning and just let the system take care of that for you. But anyway, the key thing is you are explicitly limited to what is possible to configure within that journey type. Okay, that's the view to look at. And then the other side of that is when you're looking into transactional, it is very similar. At the moment it does support the email, and it will tell you, well, I need to have a transactional definition and then an email. So it's the same way you go through the configuration, you do the setup, and then the trigger for the transactional is always API. So you'll have to kind of figure out what the flow would be for the API to come and trigger it. But practically you're setting up the sort of receiving endpoint. You've got the email configured, same way, no other activities in the journey. Again, can you look into exploring Einstein? Yes, you can. Same sort of features as you get for the single send. If you want to optimize the send time, you can. If you want to look into the optimization of the frequencies and whatnot, again, it might not be good to send something, define that. To me, this is a bit odd because transactional API in nature should be something that is almost, intentionally send out when you want that to go, so when it triggers. If you purchase a receipt, you don't really care per se how many other messages the person received or what was the best time for them to open it. So to me, Einstein sort of, while it might be useful, most of the use cases should not be applicable for that, and this is pretty much just configuring the user interface, like the API endpoint. You choose the data extension, same way as you do for triggered send, by the way, so it's the same template, and then you choose the email, and off we go. Well, that configuration is done, and then we can start feeding the data for through the API calls to trigger that. You will see next time when we actually initiate the journey, I'll walk you through briefly in some of the details here in terms of history and analytics. Template wise, I think one thing I didn't cover too much, but you've got a few options to start the journey from certain templates that we design. These are good things to explore if you get a chance, because they do provide some hints on the canvas when you start configuring them, what could be the good use cases to go. So if you're looking to take in a welcome journey as a good example, this is something that is almost pre-narrated for you, and it tells you who do we expect, how do you go through that, links and documentation, like what would you expect to be configured here, what messages would you get. So there's extra extra hints that otherwise are not available if you're creating the journey yourself or creating your own templates. These are some sort of best practices that are incorporated for you by our team. Okay, that sort of wraps me up. This is all I wanted to go through today. We're just in time, but I'm more than happy to answer any questions if there are any questions. Chibu, how are we going?
Yeah, kind of answered most of the ones that came up, so I don't have any questions yet.
That's perfect.
Probably wait for a couple of minutes or
Yep.
so. Just a quick thing. The goal for the exit criteria and the goal for the journey, are we covering it next time?
Good catch. That's the one I think I forgot to do that. We should have done it here as well. Thank you for picking it up. So the goal and exit criteria are two similar things, but there is, when you start, the journey itself, the goal will attribute to the success. So when we configure the goal, which I will do now here, and I will say I can only access the contact data. I do not have access to the journey data in this configuration. Remember, goals are always data driven. So in my case, I want people to submit my survey, and I want to say ambitiously 70% of everyone who gets into the journey has to submit this survey. So let me have a look into customer transactions, rental, feedback, and we say I might target the score. Maybe I want to do and say, well, overall score category, and I can try to do that, but the system will start complaining. But anyway, I'm still going to go and say, yeah, that's fine. So I want to have a high, done, and when I go next, the system tell me, well, how many people do you expect to produce the high score value? Now maybe I want to say number of total people. It could be 200. So once I get 200 with the overall score, it hits 100%, and then it starts incrementing through the number. Or I might actually say, well, practically I would hopefully expect, let's say, 40% of the total population. So I change it to be percent value driven to score high their rental experience. And ideally it shouldn't be uppercase. Now I do have an option to say, if I find the customers who do provide the feedback and it is on that high score, they're going to be exited out of the journey. Practically it may not be the case, because I still want to continue and say, well, for those who are members, I do not want them I do want members to get out, but for non-members I want to invite them to be a member, and therefore this is not really the ultimate right goal for me. So I'll click done, and when I start the journey, it will actually start attributing to that, and you will start seeing some of the success results. We'll configure it and we'll see how it sort of shows up next time. The exit criteria on the other side is similar to that, but in a way that it defines the data point, but when the customer matches, we're not calculating or adding or attributing to the success of the journey or failure of the journey. It's just as simple as the customer's already provided feedback. We don't want to go up and nudge them and whatever. So we might say, well, what if that customer is maybe part of the certain tier of the membership group? We want to get rid of the asking for the feedback altogether. So let's say exclude. We'll switch off uppercase, so exclude Platinum loyalty tier from survey. And then I'm going to go and say again contact data, but I'm going to look into loyalty membership, loyalty member, and I said the tier equals Platinum. I think that would be right spelling. And then I click next and I click done. And in this case now, if I get a member who gets into the journey and he or she is at the Platinum tier, regardless of everything else, they're not actually going to even get to that control group. They're going to be exited right away at the entry point. If at any point in time they go through the journey, maybe we look at them and say, okay, we send a feedback survey and they get action or no action and their status changed, and the system will do evaluation on the next time when they're making decision, and it will go, hold on a second, that person is already Platinum, off they go. So it's just kind of like works at the certain activities and certain times. If you want to know a bit more, read on the trailhead. It's like the trail actually walks through the details and differences between goal and journey criteria, exit criteria really well. It's just worth something to be aware of. But for us, good catch, Shibu, it's something that we definitely wanted to have. And in the guide, when you go through the guide, it will be included for you as a part of the configuration too. So we definitely want that to be a piece of that. Very good question.
Great. There's one more question that just came up. So what's the difference between using the exit criteria and the exclusion script? And when should one be used for best case scenarios?
Excellent question. Loved it. Exclusion script is something that is applied at the email send level. So when the system comes here and says, well, we need to send a feedback reminder, you can look into maybe some logic, and within the email send, at the time of sending email, we can say, no, we don't want to send it. If you exit criteria, it's exiting you from the entire journey experience. So it kind of goes and say there is nothing else that's going to be evaluated. At any point in time when the customer data met exit criteria, the customer is taken out of the journey straight away. So that's kind of like providing you a bit of a context and differences. Practically, within the journey, if you're thinking about making some decisions, you should almost never get to the use case where it would be appropriate to use what do I call it, the exit script, right? So the exclusion script, sorry, because it's kind of becoming a question of, if you get to the point where you're intending to send an email, you should have done all appropriate decisions beforehand within the journey using data decisions or any other flows to avoid sending if it's not appropriate. So it's rarely that you're going to use that. The right approach for using exclusion script is when you're triggering the email through API and the calling environment doesn't have ability to make a full decision. So it could be some data that is only sitting in Marketing Cloud, not in that system, that influences the decision to send or not to send. So in this case, you can go trigger the message, the exclusion script, before doing actual send, it will apply the criteria and say, oh, hold on a second, actually we need not send an email in this case, and it will suppress that single email sent. It's not going to exclude customer from any other experiences, it's purely taking them away from sending that singular email communication. So that's a big difference, and that's the right way of kind of thinking about the exclusion script. Ideally, you want to avoid using them or doing complex use cases, scenarios and logic, because it's really hard to maintain, and practically it's invisible in the system unless someone goes up into that send configuration, looks into that field of the exclusion script and kind of realizes, wow, there is a whole lot of criteria here that may or may not be relevant these days. It was good at the time when we set it up, but things could change. So it's kind of like almost like your last choice of preferences. If you're configuring the email send, it should be, should we or should we not use exclusion script? Ideally should be, no, we shouldn't. It's like only in the rare cases, as I said, you can go back and say, like, okay, there is no other way to deal with that. We'll kind of go and flow with it.
Awesome. Thanks, Vlad.
Cool. Well, any other questions that might have come up?
Yep, nothing yet.
No,
that's
all good.
That's all we had today.
That's good, and we're sort of nearly on time with 5 extra minutes. I just want to say thank you for staying with us. Hopefully today was as useful as before, and look forward to talking to you guys next week. Until then, have a great weekend, have a great week ahead, and until next time.
Thank you, Vlad. Thank you, everyone.
Take care.